looking for that. We will announce a new date shortly. Turning to Myanmar, the situation at hand, it has been more than 2 months since the February 1 coup in Myanmar, and the situation inside the country, I don't think anyone needs reminding, has continued to deteriorate amidst daily killings, detention, torture of unarmed civilians, and now bombing and attacks in ethnic areas of Myanmar. And after checking some figures this morning, we can see that deaths are rapidly approaching. They're just under 600, mainly unarmed civilians killed since February 1, with nearly 3,000 detained and arrest warrants out for more than 480 people, and no signs of it letting up. The economy is collapsing. I just saw a note from Fitch Solutions, which is part of the Fitch Ratings Group, predicting a very conservative minus 20% contraction in the economy this year, Myanmar's economy, which is basically a complete collapse, and much faster than people had previously guessed. And among groups being targeted, and which is why also the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand is trying to take a special role, journalists who are, at this point, are amongst the last available window on Myanmar and what's going on there, amidst internet blackouts and increasing targeting of media. And as well, of course, government workers, civil society groups, and particularly those connected with the NLD, the National League for Democracy, led by State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, who remains in detention and on trial. So, as mentioned, the suspension of broadband Wi-Fi services has added to difficulties, particularly for media. We're very lucky to have with us our two other panellists, Tom Keane from Frontier magazine and Aimeen Thant, a freelance journalist who can give some real insight into the situation on the ground. So ahead of our week-long closure for the annual Songkran holiday from Monday, I'd like to present this excellent panel. As mentioned, on the far left, Tom Keane, Editor-in-Chief of Frontier Myanmar. Next to him on the right is Aimeen Thant, freelance journalist, formerly with Reuters Myanmar. Just on my far right at the desk here is Phil Robertson, representative of Human Rights Watch. And next to him, closest to me, is James Rodahava, Chief of UN OCHR Myanmar team. That's the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So I thought that we could begin. There's a lot to discuss. We will try and take questions over Facebook, if I can work my phone while I'm moderating, and also from the floor. And we need to finish by midday, so we've got about 80 minutes. So I thought we could begin with Tom, sitting there in Yangon, and perhaps you can brief us on the situation on the ground. Over to you.
Grant. Thanks very much. First of all, I apologize for the dark lighting here. As you mentioned, the internet challenges in Yangon are pretty immense at the moment. So I'm actually at my mum's house because she has fiber internet.
Ah.
So if you hear some grade 3 classes going on in the background, you'll know what it is. So it's a bit of a mixed picture at the moment inside the country. Obviously, it's a very dark picture, but in terms of the protests, in Yangon, they've largely stopped, although we see some isolated protests. But in other areas, continuing to varying degrees, we've seen a significant escalation in violence in Sagaing region, close to the border with India. And that entire region of Sagaing has been, a very strong, had very strong resistance from the start, particularly around Moiwa, where protests continue, and rural areas northwest of Mandalay, where we've seen police having to abandon some rural police stations and so on. So recently in Tamu, on the border between Sagaing region and India, we saw protesters fight back with weapons and grenades, killing a number of police and soldiers. So So where the protests are continuing, we're often seeing more violence, which I think is a natural kind of response to the tactics that the Tatmadaw is using against the protesters. This really just brutal response that we've seen trying to crush all resistance. In terms of the protests kind of winding down to some extent since the start of April, if we think about why that's happened, it is partly a consequence of that extreme brutality. In like the end of March, obviously on Armed Forces Day or Revolution Day, there was a huge number of protesters killed, and we saw, the response in South Dagon, in Yangon, where there were grenade launchers used and other kind of military-style weapons against protesters. And that has certainly taken a toll. I think there is a feeling to some extent that it is, the tactics that were being used in the protests until now might not be effective, when the military uses that level of violence. But I think there's more to it than that. The mobile internet shutdown in particular has really had quite a significant effect. I mean, if you think about, I'm talking to you from a fiber connection in Yangon, but in rural areas and even in provincial cities, there just aren't fiber connections. So you basically got no internet. And people are really in the dark about what's happening. And I think the internet has been really powerful for uniting people, creating a sense of solidarity, that, protests in one part of the country are being reciprocated in other areas of the country. I think that's been a really powerful dynamic that we've seen. And we have lost that with the shutdown of mobile data in particular. So there was one estimate in Nikkei that there's only about 600,000 active connections left in the country, fiber connections. And also lots of rumors the internet will be cut entirely over Water Festival. I'm a little skeptical about that because the pattern so far has been that shutdowns are announced the night before. So this would be a break with that pattern if those rumors are true. That said, I expect we'll see, it's not that the protests have entirely stopped, as I said, and I think we'll see escalations again. And what I expect more of is just a less overt, a kind of chronic resistance to military rule and a sort of shift in tactics a little bit. I'll be interested to hear what the other panelists, what their view is on this. But and the other thing is that if the internet is switched back on again, particularly mobile data, I think that will re-energize some of the protest movements. The internet does really present a problem for the military regime, what to do there, because there is a huge economic cost of turning off the internet, mobile data, and we've also seen fixed wireless shut down as well. And, this is just not something they expected to have to do. And they're not prepared, to manage this problem. And really, I don't think that they feel they have any alternative but to shut it down. But there's this question about how do they manage that over the longer term, given that switching it back on will probably re-energize the protests. I think, I've talked a bit about the protests, but there's other strands of opposition to military rule, and the most important of those is CDM, the Civil Disobedience Movement, which continues to remain fairly strong from what we can work out. It's quite hard to know because it's very decentralized and leaderless, but there haven't been reports, I haven't heard of reports of large numbers of civil servants going back to work. And what we do see is efforts by the military to coerce people to return to work. And I think this really reflects the difficulty that they have responding to this. I mean, there's an obvious way for them to respond to street protests. There's not an obvious way for them to respond to the CDM movement, because at the end of the day, they really can't afford to have hundreds of thousands of teachers refuse to work or, have to fire them. That would cripple the education system. And I know that's not a priority, but on the other hand, it does undermine, if they can't reopen schools or hospitals, it does undermine their authority and their sense of legitimacy. So I think this is a really big challenge for them that they don't really have an answer to. And the fact that is still continuing is really important.
Tom, given that you're sitting in the middle of Yangon, can I just ask, there's an impression, because if media gets footage, we're just seeing these terrible scenes of troops shooting into houses and grabbing people at night. But friends I'm talking to who, I guess middle class and live in parts of Yangon that are very nice parts in nice houses, are saying it's very peaceful and they're bored at home. I mean, that's a very, very different view. I mean, what about you? Are you hearing gunshots at night? Are you hearing screams of people being dragged out? I've also had friends whose next-door neighbours have been yanked out in the middle of the night and heard gunshots. So it's really hard to get a feeling of what life really is like day to day in the middle of Yangon.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's very localized. It depends where you live and what's happening in your area. And I actually can't explain very well what it's like to live in those neighborhoods, because where I live, it's not a wealthy area, but it's a very quiet suburban area, North Dagon Township. And although there have been some protests in North Dagon, and it is officially under martial law, I mean, in my neighborhood, it's been incredibly peaceful. I mean, we had, night watch teams and barricades set up and all that kind of thing. But you don't see, soldiers walking down the street and that kind of thing. And there aren't protests outside your doorstep. If you're living in Sanchong, or if you're in parts of South Dagon, I mean, you've been living with, soldiers in the street basically for months, and police, and having to put up with, really having to endure really harrowing things happening on your doorstep. You might have had to shelter protesters. You might have had soldiers banging on your door trying to search your house. That's not been my experience, and I really count my blessings that I'm not in those areas, because I just can't imagine how you would deal with that. I mean, that is
Right.
just an incredibly difficult situation to have to endure. And you've got families, kids, tear gas coming in through the windows. I mean, just 5 kilometers from where I live. It's very odd. You've got pockets
Right.
where this is happening and large areas where it's not.
That's really interesting. And before we move on, and we'll come back to you, I just want every speaker to have their say, but maybe a little bit, Frontier's done some excellent work on the economy, and really excellent, including the breakdown of the banking system, the tax system, all that. And I mentioned that deeply grim forecast by Fitch of minus 20%. So basically the economy seems to be in free fall. Are there further points you'd like to make on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the CDM movement has, and not just the CDM movement, I mean, the response of the Myanmar people, has crippled the economy. And I'm not apportioning responsibility. I mean, the responsibility completely lies with the military here. This is a choice that people are making to do this in an effort to hurt the regime, and also just the general instability and uncertainty. I mean, if you're a business, you would not be, investing in anything long term right now. I mean, that would just be crazy. I mean, if anything, you're trying to liquidate assets and get cash. So the banking sector is a concern. Really, in Yangon, I've been driving around quite a bit the last week or two since I haven't had internet, and the only crowds you see are clustered around ATMs and the few bank branches that are actually open. I mean, if you look at the KBZ branch at Myanmar Plaza, I mean, huge lines. It's incredible, and you can only withdraw, the equivalent of barely $100 from an ATM now. But even if staff go back to work and branches reopen, it's hard to see how the sector can avoid a financial crisis of some sort. It's not clear when that would happen or what form it would take exactly, but the banks are in a huge amount of trouble. Even, people who work at the banks, the leadership of the banks will acknowledge this. I mean, it's not a secret. And they're really caught in the middle of this, a lot of pressure on the one side from the central bank and the military regime, and on the other side, public pressure, not to reopen or to do certain things. Just on the Fitch estimate, I think it was really telling that you can debate the numbers, but they ended with a warning, which I think is really telling, that there's no economic possibility that we can rule out.
Sorry, say that again. No economic possibility
that they can rule out. I mean, anything can happen. I mean, they're saying minus 20% is what we expect, but it could be far worse. I mean, it's not, everything is uncertain right now, and you can't rule anything out. And I think that's very true.
Right.
I think we could see a lot of macroeconomic instability around the exchange rate, inflation, and so on. And I think the big takeaway from this is that already because of COVID, millions of people were going to slide back into poverty and already have. And this is just going to turbocharge that process. There's going to be huge amounts of poverty in Myanmar in the next few years because of this, and just very large humanitarian needs. And it's not clear how those people can be helped in this context. Right. It's going to be very difficult.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that fairly bleak situation. Yeah. I will come back to that. I'm turning to James Rodehaver, Chief UNOHCHR Myanmar team. And James, also, I'd be really interested if you've got a view about the COVID situation, which, very few, basically nobody really knows, I suppose. But that's only if you have, don't worry if you don't have the latest figures.
Well, I don't have figures on the number of COVID infections. I don't think anyone does. And in part, there are no figures because the healthcare system has collapsed. Because not only have the medical professionals sort of led or been a huge part of the protest effort, but also because the Tatmadaw and the military regime have been occupying hospitals. They've been launching attacks on healthcare facilities. There have been, I think, at this point, 28 different actual attacks on hospitals, ambulances, or clinics. And then, of course, you've had over 40 hospitals that have been occupied by the Tatmadaw. And so it's created a dissuasive effect. People don't want to go to these hospitals. And so the whole COVID-19 vaccination effort has stopped. And people that are getting sick aren't reporting it. In fact, I think about the only cases that end up being reported are the people that come into Myanmar, or come from Myanmar into Thailand. And then it seems that there is no chance lost to report Myanmar citizens crossing into the country with COVID. But so it is a huge problem, and this is one of the unintended consequences of the CDM movement. But I guess it just raises a question that in the face of a failure from the international community to take decisive action, the people are left with no choice but to continue taking action themselves, and in some cases that means that they have to hurt their own economic interests in order to make a very clear political statement. That this is not acceptable. And most importantly, I think that it goes back to the nature of this crisis as this is not a humanitarian crisis, even though there will be humanitarian dimensions to it. It's not a political crisis. This is a human rights crisis. It has, and what that means is that it has its origins in the fact that the Tatmadaw have been able to operate for decades with complete impunity for their actions and activities. They have been rolling out their coup and their post-coup efforts to control the country through human rights violations. Whether it be dismantling basic rule of law and due process protections, whether it be unraveling any protection of privacy, whether it be the complete violation of internet privacy in particular, or completely cutting off access to the internet. They had test runs of this in Rakhine for years, so they know exactly the impact it makes, not only whenever you keep people from communicating in secure ways over the internet, but you also keep the flow of information out. You prevent communications. And that, unfortunately, is very effective, because right now, to get information out of certain parts of the country, it's becoming increasingly difficult. And these areas of blackout, you can only imagine what's happening. That's why one of the things that I would just say is that as they've rolled out this coordinated, systematic use of lethal force against the population, yes, at least 600 people have died now. That's documented. But the number is probably much higher. And that is one of the things that this communications blackout enables. It enables the ability of them to hide the death toll. And of course, what is also just catastrophic about the way they have implemented this coup and this use of force is that as they've escalated the use of force, what is it? It's 66% of all the people killed. It's happened just in the last 17 days. I mean, this is a long-term coup, but at this point, it's very recent events where most people have died, and that's because that in very coordinated stages, they have upped the way they have used force, going from crowd control tactics to the use of this very heavy, non-lethal weaponry, the stun grenades, the rubber bullets, up to where they were using automatic rifles. Then they were using automatic rifles with indiscriminate fire, and then heavy military armaments, RPGs, fragmentation grenades, heavy machine guns, and what that has done is has dramatically increased the death toll, and that's apparent. I think it's 91% of all of the deaths have been by gunshot. And I think it's between 16 and 18% of all those gunshots have been shots to the head. And this speaks to how they've used snipers and how they've used military professionals, to unleash this violence on an unarmed civilian population. It also speaks to the other nature of this very systematic, coordinated attack that they have launched against their own people. And that is the way that they've also detained people. These night raids and the way they've arrested people, it's been very coordinated, it's been escalated, and it's been increasingly targeted. And this also goes back to the restrictions on internet and the way that they have unraveled privacy protections, is that they are now going out and targeting people specifically that have dissented to the coup or criticized the coup leadership online. And right now they have, I believe it's close to 70 civil society activists in detention. They have, there are another 463 people that are in hiding because arrest warrants have been issued. I mean, it's a rather dramatic spike in the last week in the number of arrest warrants that have been issued. And a lot of those arrest warrants are people that they're looking for because of their online conduct. So the fruits of these illegitimate legal changes that they put in place early on in the coup, these packages of anti-privacy rights legislation or amendments, they're bearing the fruits of that now, and the restrictions they're placing on internet providers. So that's another factor in all of this. Right now, I think that perhaps one of the gravest things that they've done, and I guess it's one of the final pieces of this whole puzzle on the impact of how they have detained, how they have unraveled protections, it has been their systematic targeting of media organizations. And the fact that they have shut down or canceled the licenses to operate of so many media outlets. The fact that they have arrested, at this point, at least 50 journalists. And they have kept 26 journalists who are still in detention. And this goes back as well to the enforced disappearances. There are hundreds of the 2,850 so detainees. Several hundred of those people were taken into custody quite early on, and they've never been heard from since. The government doesn't acknowledge they're being in detention. No one knows where they are. Their families don't know where they are. And all of this just creates a heavier and heavier disincentive from people to continue demonstration. And so what this, I think, shows is really two things. One, it's the extent to which the Tatmadaw still don't have control of the country, which, given the heavy-handedness of the tactics, given the huge amount of resources that they're throwing at this effort to get the country under control, it's all the more remarkable that they still don't have control. And then, of course, lastly is the bravery of people to still continue to protest. The inventiveness and the varied ways in which people are protesting. They're going out of their way. The vast majority of protesters are going out of their way to show that they are making a political statement in a peaceful way. and which is quite a remarkable thing given the brute force and violence that's been directed against them. The last thing I guess I should just touch on is just this increasing phenomenon, though, of the other side of the protest movement, which is, of course, this increasing call for self-defense. And it is worrying to see that, you know, violence is resulting in some of these protests. And it, of course, plays into the military response. It also plays into the sort of the weakening, or I guess the unraveling of the national ceasefire agreement in several places, and how there is sort of a steady, it seems like a steady march to possible civil war in the country. And with the targeting of the RCSS, the KIA, the KNLU or KNLA, you just have just a steady, you know, doubling down of the authoritarian response, the military response, and sort of a march to conflict. And if that happens, then of course there's only going to be one result to that, which is going to be a lot more civilians are going to die.
Right. Are you saying, though, that they shouldn't, the CDM and protesters, you know, signs that they are trying to arm themselves, understandably,
Yeah, of course.
But that, you know, in a way, is it better for them not to, and then just?
Well, I'm just saying that there are unintended consequences, and that whenever you take up arms against the Tatmadaw, you take up arms against a well-trained military force with military hardware, and of course a very brutal history that has shown no reluctance to invoke the worst, harshest kinds of use of force in spite of people being totally unarmed. So now that people are arming themselves, you can expect just as violent or even worse in terms of a response.
Right. Thank you. That was excellent. We'll return to some of those points. Over to you, Amin Thant, as also a reporter out there on the ground. You have insights, and also I think it's interesting that a lot of the protesters killed are men, but I see there's a lot of women also being arrested. And I wonder about the role of, you know, we've seen some incredibly brave women out there in the CDM as well. And I know, well, you're one of them, and you have colleagues as well. So maybe that's a sector you could also perhaps tell us a little bit more about. But overall, why don't you start with your overview?
Yeah, so I think there is a lot of kind of overlapping and sometimes conflicting gender dynamics that are at play in the various aspects of the anti-coup resistance. So, you know, when there were protests, and even now there are these sort of, you know, smaller engagements with security forces, maybe sabotage efforts, you know, conflicts in war, in areas where there's sort of, I guess, more formal war with ethnic armed organizations being involved, you do see more men being killed, especially with the, you know, gunshots and these sort of military-grade weapons. And you know, that's in part because in these sort of street protests, there are just sort of more men around, although there have been a number of sort of prominent female leaders who have stepped forward, as well as women's organizations that have really been deeply involved in organizing protesters, as well as leading the sort of labor organizational part of the movement. And you know, I think we saw a really striking visual representation of kind of these gender conversation that's been happening with the Tamain protests, and women essentially donating their clothes in order to form a sort of spiritual psychic barrier and to undermine the sort of misogynistic, hierarchical, masculine-centered organization of the Tatmadaw. But at the same time, I think there's quite a lot of work that's being done by women kind of behind the scenes, especially logistically. So if we talk about laborers who have been really organized and really been a huge part of the non-street protest-based resistance in terms of government workers who are not showing up to work, or even private sector workers like garment industry workers. A very large amount of the organizers there, and as well as the staff, have been women. And there's all of this sort of hidden networks of distribution of money, of finding people new housing, of getting people back out of jail. The majority of people who've been arrested have been men, and so it's the women who have to try to get them out, to get them bailed out, figure out where they are. And you see this dynamic in which male bodies tend to be sort of the ones who get killed the most up front, but you see women sort of taking on a lot of this invisible labor, and also functioning with the background knowledge of the Tamil's long history of using sexual violence as a tactic of terror and of repression, and having to go out with fear sort of from their families, and understanding that this is a possibility, and then also facing the people who might do that to them as they're going out and doing their work, whether that is sort of in these more public street protests or in these sort of background logistical roles.
Right. And as a reporter, a very active one, your insights on how reporters are actually dealing with this. It's amazing how much is still getting out on Twitter and Instagram. I mean, somehow people are getting access to social media, but on the ground, how are reporters getting around things and dealing with it, and still getting news out?
I mean, I guess in part, it's easy in that it's kind of happening in your own backyard. It's never, journalism is not the most lucrative field. And in Myanmar, that's also true. And a lot of people who are media workers are not necessarily solely media workers. There's quite a small army of journalists who are stringers, who do this part-time, who do this sort of more informally, who have just very deep networks and connections that have been built up over time. So I think in part, the lack of development of Myanmar's media industry has also led to a situation in which there are quite a large number of people who are acting as citizen journalists, who are not necessarily being paid or recognized, but are doing the work that they feel is necessary in order to either inform the world of what's happening or create and preserve evidence for future accountability mechanisms.
It's true, the citizen journalist seems to have come to the fore as well.
Yeah, so I think in that sense, it's a little bit easier in that you can be a bit more anonymous, especially if you haven't been formally working in the media or sort of are more well known. And I think we're seeing that where a large number of people are kind of able to slip under the radar, where there are certain people and certain outlets like Myanmar Now, Frontier, that are more targeted and kind of bear the brunt of the sort of active persecution.
Right. Okay, well, thanks for that, and we'll come back to a couple of the points you raised, but before turning to Phil, I just wanted to say, Tom, since we are talking about media, from the perspective of an editor, being responsible for reporters and, deciding stories and things, Frontier has been one of the bravest publications amongst, all 5 that were supposedly banned and lost their licenses are still continuing to put stuff out there. I presume your reporters are very committed, but what's the editor's perspective of all this, and how long can you go on? I mean, obviously there's a lot of need to be covert. You can't access your offices, etc.
Yeah, so I mean, well, Frontier's been lucky in that we haven't been banned yet. We weren't in the batch of 5 media organizations that were banned. That hugely complicates, the job of our team if we are banned. And I just can't stress like how brave the journalists from like Myanmar Now and Mizima and DBB who are continuing to work are. And we have seen at least one of them arrested in Naypyidaw. There's probably more that I'm not aware of. But yeah, I mean, as an editor, you worry every day about your journalists who are going out, particularly to cover not just journalists and photographers in particular, who are going out to cover the protests, especially over the last month as it's got more and more violent. And, the risks are huge. I mean, there hasn't been a lot of discrimination between, from the security forces between who's a protester, who's a bystander, who's a medic, who's a journalist. They are putting themselves in a great amount of danger, and we do worry, and we have asked them repeatedly to try to minimize, to continue to do their job if they're comfortable doing it, but to minimize the risk to themselves as much as possible, to not necessarily go out every day, right to the front lines when the protests were going on in Yangon. But what we found was it was very hard to convince them that this was the right approach. And it was a constant kind of battle. I mean, we definitely didn't want to stop them from doing their job, just to kind of minimize the risk to themselves that, they could be either detained or shot. And unfortunately, one of our reporter/photographer in Mandalay was shot on Armed Forces Day through the hand. He recently wrote about this experience. And he's still recovering, and I think that just speaks to the risks. I understand there's been at least 2 other photojournalists who have been shot as well. But also the legal risks are really concerning at the same time. We've seen journalists who are covering the protests just be picked up and detained and charged with offences that carry a 3-year prison term. So our approach has been to continue to do our job, basically. I mean, to try not to deviate from what we would normally be doing, but just to be a bit clever about how we go about our work to minimize those risks. We are very grateful, very happy, I should say, that we haven't been banned, because that would just hugely complicate things for us as an organization. And we're lucky that hasn't happened. We're very aware that it's a risk. But, you don't want to moderate your coverage. I mean, we're not sort of pulling punches on what we report. I think for Frontier, it helps the type of publication we are. We mostly do features, predominantly in English, although we do also publish in Burmese. I think we're a little bit less on the radar of the military regime, and also don't have as much influence in Burmese language, which is what they're particularly sensitive to. So I think that's worked in our favor in a way that, like Myanmar Now, it has made them a target because they're very popular in Burmese language.
Right. Okay, thanks for that. We'll just turn to Phil now for Human Rights Watch and your perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Gwen. So it's always tough to sort of be the last person on the panel to sort of sweep through what everybody else has discussed. Yeah. But I mean, what I would say is that, and this is something I've said frequently, that Myanmar is in the middle of a tug of war. And it's a bit of a tug of war to the death, frankly, with the people in the CDM on one side working to strangle the economy and make the country ungovernable, and the Tatmadaw and the police, who have been completely unleashed, trying to make it unsafe to go onto the streets. They're trying to, in some ways, force the people back to a pre-2011 mindset of fear, to get people to agree to submit to military rule, and they're using lethal force. They're cutting off the internet, they're cutting off media access, and they're trying to re-isolate Myanmar so that they can basically commit the rights abuses that they want without witnesses. And I think, what is different that the military didn't count on this time was not only the impact of the internet, but also the sheer size, breadth, and overwhelming popularity of this fight against the military coup. and against the Tatmadaw police, who, have just been enraging people with the tactics that they have been engaged in, this violence, these killings, these arrests, the detention and torture, in some cases torture to death of people in custody. And when we talk to people in Myanmar, people should in some ways, but more than being afraid, they're angry. They're really angry. And they're like, we're not going to go anywhere, we're not backing down. And so what we're seeing is neither side is giving an inch. Dr. Sasa from the CRPH was just on CNN the other day, and he was predicting that there may be many more bloody months, and he was demanding the international community take action. He said, CDM is a nonviolent movement, but the people have the right to defend themselves. And, if the international community doesn't intervene and implement what he called for, the responsibility to protect doctrine, then civil conflict is likely to widen and it may move towards a civil war. And on the other side, you've got Min Aung Hlaing basically giving a speech the other day, basically blaming everything on the civil disobedience movement, claiming that, quote, although protests are staged in neighboring countries and the international community, they do not destroy businesses. CDM is an activity to destroy the country. And, so you have this widening gap that is also accompanied by increased violence and violent tactics by the military. And there's a dueling fight between the two sides to negate each other's existence as well. So the CRPH has declared null and void the 2008 Constitution, which, of course, the military claims to be upholding and following, and they use to justify the military coup. And they've declared the junta terrorist. And the military, of course, has declared the CRPH illegal and saying that any engagement with them opens people up for prosecution under the Unlawful Associations Act. We even saw the other night, the pro-CRPH ambassador in London locked out of the embassy. I guess he went out for a cup of tea and came back, and the doors were locked, and there was under new management. And coming into the middle of this, of course, we also have the ethnic groups that are coming off the sidelines. There was just an article in the Bangkok Post today where one of the people in the leaders of the group of 10 armed groups that were involved in the national ceasefire agreement are basically saying that Tatmadaw has destroyed the NCA. There is no government, no police process, and no political dialogue. So a very dire situation moving forward. So what is the international community going to do in this sort of situation? That's sort of what I was asked to speak about. And I can get into some other things as well, but I think that right now we are facing a situation where the international community has been too slow. It has been not heavy enough in what it's trying to do, and it needs to really pick up its game. There needs to be targeted economic sanctions against the military, both personnel and military companies. There has to be a concerted effort to really cut off sources of international funding in international proceeds that are supporting the military. And that includes, for instance, the oil and gas proceeds that Total and Chevron are paying into the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. And there needs to be greater efforts to expand a coalition of nations that are prepared to take actions. Right now we have the US, we have the UK, we have Canada, we have the European Union, which have taken sanctions, but they've all been following a process of like, let's sanction and then take a look and see, what is the reaction. And the problem is that nothing has really risen to the level of attention that will make the Tatmadaw reconsider what they're doing. That is the fundamental problem. We haven't found the lever yet that will really awaken the Tatmadaw and recognize that if they go further down this road, all they will see is ruin. And we have not been able to expand the coalition of like-minded countries to include other important countries like Australia, Japan, and South Korea, who also have significant leverage on the economy. We haven't even been able to persuade the Singapore banks, for instance, to take action against what we believe are significant assets that the Burmese militaries and their families have in that banking system. The Myanmar people are getting quite impatient. They are calling, as I mentioned, for this responsibility to protect, which frankly, given the current situation at the UN Security Council with the opposition of China and Russia is basically not going to happen. The UN Security Council has done a lot as far as the UN Security Council is concerned. They've had this presidential statement, they've had these press statements. They've gone about as far as they can, I think, unless they're prepared to go to a UN resolution. And we have been urging them to do that, saying basically if China and Russia are going to support a military that is shooting children in their homes, well, make them do that publicly. Make them make the political argument why they think it's all right to support that kind of military. Why shouldn't there be a global arms embargo imposed by a UN Security Council resolution against the police and the military of Myanmar? Not only a sort of an indication of the kind of significant global disapproval that really indicates that the international community is not going to go along with this, and to basically show the international community is going to come in on the side of trying to protect human rights and seeing the restoration of democracy that we have not. And we've seen a lot of statements. I mean, we've got the UN Special Envoy arriving in the next day or so here. We've got the Human Rights Council. We've had 2 resolutions. We have the Special Rapporteur, Tom Andrews, now calling, like, if the UN Security Council is not going to do something, maybe there should be a special meeting. The UN Security Council, as mentioned, has spoken. There's talk about actually a UN General Assembly resolution. But I can't yet find a good answer to respond to the Burmese protesters said, what does UN stand for? United Nothing? That basically statements are great. Statements have their places, but then what is going to be done? And I think there's a widening gap between the international community's assessment of what they can do and what the expectations of the Burmese people are. And those may be unrealistic expectations. The reality is that we're not going to see probably UN peacekeepers or blue helmets being sent into Burma. It's just not a possibility. But there has to be somewhere that is going to basically find some sort of movement forward. Now, ASEAN has been talked about as a potential player here, and there's even been talk about appointing a sort of special envoy from ASEAN. The name floated has been the former Prime Minister of Singapore, Goh Chok Tong. Right now, but the problem is that ASEAN is hopelessly divided. In some ways, is divided as what we see going on in Myanmar, where you have countries like the CL, the Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and frankly Thailand, not being willing to really significantly intervene or interfere as they see it in the internal affairs of Myanmar, versus a more activist group such as Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and Brunei, the chair of ASEAN, in the middle, sort of saying, okay, which way are we going to go next? When do you want to hold the meeting where? The reality is that even if you do get into a negotiation with ASEAN trying to play a role, and everybody looks at what happened during Typhoon Nargis, where you had a very dynamic Secretary General, Surin Pitsuwan, playing a key role. We don't have that right now in terms of ASEAN Secretariat and leadership, nor do we have any indication that there's going to be an area of negotiation to be had between the two sides. If ASEAN was going to go in and negotiate, who are they going to negotiate on behalf of the CDM? I mean, they would say, okay, we have to recognize the CRPH, but if you talk about this, if you have the CRPH in the room, the Tatmadaw are not going to come. And then on the other side of it, when there was discussion early on in the process where Indonesia was saying, well, geez, we'll have a negotiation where will assure that a year from now there's an election that is free and fair, there was no willingness to allow that to happen. And of course, there was popular protests in front of the Indonesian embassy. So we're sort of not only at a great divide within Myanmar, but we're also a great divide in the international community about how to take it forward.
Right. Thanks, Phil. It's also good, though, to see a lot of unity from human rights groups and, you know, some of the bigger international human rights organisations. I just perhaps like to turn to some questions we've got coming in, and also people are welcome to ask questions from the floor. We usually have a microphone, I think, Kuntama. Oh, it's a hand mic. Oh, yeah, that's being set up at the back there. But I'll just ask a couple that have come in on Facebook and WhatsApp. One question from Hong Kong University journalism student Robbie Wu, who would like to ask about what is clearly looming here and in Thailand, its own crisis about refugees. What are the prospects of a large-scale refugee crisis and the implications of that? Perhaps, James, since you're based in Thailand and looking at the situation, perhaps you might have some thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I think that the danger is there. I mean, right now we've already seen some refugee movements, people fleeing from the Karen areas into Thailand, and particularly if you have an escalation of the clashes with a number of armed groups, then it's possible to have another influx into Bangladesh. We've already seen some influx into India as well. And so far, what's remarkable so far is there haven't been more people moving, and particularly since you've had at so many different stages, people trying to get away from areas where they have been in danger. And thus far, I guess regionally, you could say that the region has been it's multiple regions, but the South Asian region and Southeast Asia has been lucky that people have been finding areas of solace inside Myanmar still. But if this conflict broadens into the ethnic states along the border areas, you will see refugee flows. And again, to bring it back to the point on the Security Council, that will raise a lot of questions, I think, about international peace and security and whether that is being affected by the situation in the country. And it creates yet another impetus for international action. And the reason why action is needed now. Don't wait until another massive crisis opens up that further destabilizes the region. Act now.
Right. Thanks. Yes, I think on the refugee thing that the big human rights dimension, a lot of confusion in Thailand about what Thailand's stance is, and actual commitments or statements by the Thai Prime Minister assuring that refugees will receive humanitarian assistance and won't be pushed back, but actually the reality on the ground. I can see you're moving to say something, Phil. So there is a disconnect there.
I was going to say that traditionally Thailand, when they're facing a new influx of refugees or possible new influx, will have a tough approach first to try to discourage everybody from coming, and then will basically over a period of time be willing to do more things. And so I think it's very important that the international community raise with Thailand what their international obligations are to protect refugees and asylum seekers. I think it's also very important to allow for humanitarian supplies that have been gathered by local communities inside Thailand to be able to be sent to people in distress across the border. In fact, that's in Thailand's interest. It would be, I think that they don't want more people to come here. I think there is a very serious concern within the Ministry of Public Health in Thailand and other parts of the Thai government about COVID-19. They view these protests as being a massive super spreader event in Myanmar. And so, they should allow for cross-border assistance to be provided, humanitarian assistance to people who are fleeing desperate situations, so that they have the food, medical assistance, and other basic necessities to be able to survive in their current situation. And the fact that some of that was blocked last week and early this week is very distressing.
Right. So I presume we've got to see some developments on that front in coming days. I notice that another few thousand tried to cross, I think in the last 24 hours, and reports are that they were pushed back. So turning to another question, I think for Tom and really one of our members, Eugene Belengli of Novosti, RIA Novosti, asked, how big is the chance that some part of the protest movement will turn to a more organised armed struggle and even form the first non-ethnic opposition armed group in decades, as we saw, well, in Thailand in the 70s after the Thammasat massacre, but also I think after 1988 in Myanmar after the crackdown then. Perhaps, Tom, do you want to tackle that one first, and then you, if you have thoughts on that?
Maybe A should go first. I mean, she might have a better idea than I do about this one. I'd be really interested to get her opinion on it.
Seem to be nodding there.
Sure. It's always a little bit tricky to predict the future. So I think Tom is throwing me under the bus here to be wrong first.
You don't, I mean, actually, none of you have to answer any questions you don't want to.
I'll answer. But I do think, we were talking a lot earlier about unintended consequences.
Sorry, could you repeat that? The speaker is a little bit muddy.
No worries. I was saying that we were speaking a lot earlier of unintended consequences, and I think, the internet shutdowns and the sort of repressive things that the army has been doing in order to suppress dissent and not allow for people to simply exist, right? Like they're not discriminating between bystanders and people who are protesting. They're preventing people from communicating, from being able to gather in a peaceful way that feels, if not safe, at least safer than, walking alone down your street that has a military outpost there where people, might just decide to kill you. And given the sort of gridlock on the international level, it seems inevitable to me that there will be a development of armed resistance that is not divided among ethnic lines. And we're already seeing people developing weapons that are not, defensive. I think earlier in the protests, you saw a lot of people reaching out and trying to find resources for creating bulletproof vests or having better helmets. Asking about what kind of barricades to build, what sort of materials should be used. And now you're seeing people creating, essentially guns at home with piping and, things that you can kind of just find online and that are relatively low tech, but would allow people to essentially engage in either, self-defense or sort of small violent operations. And as people become more isolated, I do think it is a sort of unintended consequence that people will become more radicalized, at least about their personal safety and the safety of those around them, right? Like it's easy to imagine a group of people saying, no, we need to protect our street, our block, our families, and I'm willing to use violence to do that, as opposed to a very large group of marchers who don't necessarily want to be marching along with guns, because that kind of invites violence and kind of is a sort of escalation from the protester side. And so as the sort of movement kind of fractures, I think it's easy to see kind of small independent, either, militias or groups kind of acting in a sort of mesh network where there is a similar end goal, but the independent nodes kind of function on their own.
Right. Thanks for that.
I think that was a great explanation. The role of the internet and the lack of internet is really interesting. I mean, it can be this organizing force, but as I mentioned, it can also, when you don't have it, it's very isolating, and that can have a different effect as well. I think one thing we haven't really seen, there's been a lot of talk about a federal army. I don't think we've seen like a very clear statement from CRPH of whether they support, some of the calls for the establishment of a non-ethnic armed group to sort of formalize resistance, armed resistance to the military. So there's quite ambiguous there. I mean, there's probably certainly some people who would support them coming out and taking a stronger position on that. But I think probably just 2 points I would make quickly is like, while we're talking about a sort of a gradual progression towards more violence and self-defense, mainly on the side of the protesters, I mean, we need to acknowledge that, like, for basically a month and a half, these were peaceful protests in which people were being killed, being shot at, like unarmed people, as well as the kind of associated terror, like nighttime arrests and so on. And so I think for as long as possible, people were pursuing, this nonviolent approach. And, at some point, I think that kind of had to give if the movement was going to continue, just because, I'm trying to imagine being in the head of a protester who every day is facing, an unarmed protester facing soldiers and police with automatic weapons. I mean, it just, how do you do that? Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a point where, bravery can only take you so far, I think. And so it's sort of a natural response, that would happen, because how can that situation be sustainable? You're seeing people around you being shot. The other thing is that there are weapons in Myanmar if you know where to get them. And I think the Tamu experience has been interesting. I mean, that's not an area where we've seen traditionally a lot of armed group activity, but protesters have been able to source weapons in that area from different sources. I don't really want to speculate on where they came from, but there certainly are weapons in Myanmar that are not necessarily you could arm yourself by not necessarily working directly with an ethnic armed group or being within an ethnic armed group. I mean, there are possibilities there, and we just don't know what direction things are going to go in and how different, these different forces are going to come together, really. So it's just hard to predict, as they said.
Right. Thanks very much for that, Tom. I have a question here, and by the way, we are welcoming the microphones up there if anyone wants to ask a question. A question which is slightly difficult, I think, for panellists to answer, but maybe one of you based in Thailand might. From Thomson Chow, ex-Myanmar Times associate and business editor, who notes that in Myanmar, many Western, Japanese and local companies are coming out to speak against the junta's brutality, and even things like the internet restrictions. And it's true, we're seeing companies that were traditionally quite silent, really obviously very upset and willing to speak. But one influential group that has been conspicuously silent are Thai investors, particularly groups like CP, Thai Bev, which owns spirits brand Grand Royal. So I guess it's a question about why, is there any indication, particularly in your dealings with Thai interests here who do have investments or involvement in Myanmar, why they are not saying anything, and whether civil society here or groups based here, human rights groups, are lobbying the Thais to say something on the private corporate front. Phil, you're smiling.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that one. The reality is that there's no real encouragement by the government on Thai companies to speak out on these issues, nor is there really any interest in the Thai companies in doing so. The idea that somehow Thailand is a democracy and this has got a rights-respecting business community is a complete fiction. You know, there was, Thailand loves to trumpet the fact that it was the first country to come out with a national action plan on business and human rights, but has actually done almost nothing to implement that since it was announced with great fanfare almost a year ago. These companies, CP, Thai Bev, and others, you know, their modus operandi is never say anything in public. They try to avoid that as much as possible. And, you know, they're playing for the long game. They think probably, you know, well, you know, if it turns out that this military violence takes place and, you know, 2 years down the road, all these other foreign investors have left, you know, we'll just clean up the scraps. So, I mean, I think there should be more pressure on Thailand, both the Thailand government and the Thailand business community, to ensure that what they're doing does comply, in fact, with the guiding principles on business and human rights that have been adopted by the UN, right. That their action should certainly create no harm for human rights, and in fact they have a responsibility to make sure that human rights in their operations are upheld. Right.
Okay, thank you. And James, from the UNOCHR perspective, what's your view of not just in Thailand but elsewhere? You know, the corporate community, you don't usually expect to see UN Human Rights Commission sort of cozying up or lobbying companies. But in particularly the Myanmar case, they are quite influential as key employers, providers of taxes that keeps the junta going. So is that in the sights of your organisation?
Yes, it is. You know, just recently there was a Human Rights Council resolution passed where it provided the mandate to my team in particular to reopen the work of the fact-finding mission from a few years ago, where it named corporations with ties to the Tatmadaw. And so that work of developing a better sense and a better understanding of the levels and degrees of connection to the Tatmadaw is something that we are very interested in. I mean, it is very interesting whenever you see that the work of the FFM did lead to some very interesting developments. I mean, there were a lot of companies that became very concerned about being named publicly on a list. Of course, some companies were claiming they were put wrongly on a list, and they have run kicking and screaming to OHCHR, asking us to take them off the list. And you know, I just received a letter from a Thai company just a few weeks ago, a cement company, you know, trying to say, you know, and they made quite a case of the fact that, you know, we have ended any dealings, and so we were placed on that list by mistake. So I think that there is a lot of sensitivity, and the business community in particular does not like bad press. They don't like what that says about them, and so it's why it needs more attention. And there do need to be many more public advocacy efforts to convince these companies to distance themselves from the Tatmadaw and to you know, adhere to the guiding principles for business and human rights, because these people have a lot of influence. The money is what is probably the most potent weapon that there is right now against these people, because that again is why they launched this coup to begin with, to protect their money interests.
Right. So that's going to be a priority of Human Rights Commission going forward? Yes,
going forward, of course, you know, it's a mandate. We are supposed to produce a report by September 2022. So, but of course, it's also an area where you need very specialized help and support, and so we'll be in the process of recruiting that in the near future.
Right, thank you. That's very interesting. A question there. Please identify yourself very briefly. And
yeah, no worries. Yeah, so my name's Pete, Peter Bateman from UNDP.
Yeah.
I've just got a question that come through from a colleague, so forgive me, I'm just going to read it off the phone if that's okay. For a long time, humanitarian assistance was only focused in the conflict areas of ethnic states, and as the number of incidents of violence has increased in Burma heartland, where the conflict was previously non-existent, how are humanitarian and health workers managing aid, and what are the challenges faced by them?
Right. Thanks for that. Do you have a specific panellist in mind, or do any of you on the panel specifically want to address this issue?
I mean, I can say a few words. Just, I mean, okay. Because I've been dealing with talking with some of the various different NGOs and other groups. I mean, you know, the banking system and the essentially closure of the banking system or limitations on the amount of money that can be taken out has had a huge impact on agencies and NGOs operating on the ground in Myanmar. And I'm talking about the international agencies. A lot of these are humanitarian groups that are providing assistance not only in conflict areas but others as well. And they are also fearing being targeted by increased scrutiny from the military junta. That there is military junta views these foreign NGOs in a very sort of traditional Tatmadaw way as being highly suspicious and perhaps an enemy. And so we expect that there's going to be a lot of rough sledding for international humanitarian assistance and humanitarian aid, entirely separate from the issue of like what governments will want to provide and how they want to do this and things like that, because obviously no one is going to provide any assistance to the Tatmadaw, to the military junta, and you have, in fact, donors even like Japan stepping back and saying we're not going to provide any new aid and assistance. So this is one area. The other areas, of course, you know, now we're taking what existed in Rakhine State, which was an internet block that created huge problems for humanitarian agencies to operate, and spreading it nationwide. And then third, of course, you know, there's a lot of concerns that the international NGOs and agencies have about a duty of care for their own staff, in terms of, okay, what are we asking our staff to do? Are we able to put them out there? Are they able to travel? Are they going to face retaliation? You know, the fact that they're, you know, wearing our logo, does this create a situation for them? And all these are basically unresolved. You know, there needs to be a serious humanitarian discussion about what is going to be required here, while at the same time ensuring that that humanitarian aid isn't exploited and used by the Tatmadaw, as they have shown that they will do in the past. They will politicize whatever they can get from the international community. You know, and so I would expect any sort of support provided, you know, that they can get their hands on. You know, we'll see a press conference in Naypyidaw, like, you know, government of X loves the Tatmadaw, loves the people of the security forces.
Right. Thanks, Phil. Either of you, or we might turn to the last couple of questions. Oh, sorry.
No, I would just say that you know, it is probably the biggest challenge right now with humanitarian assistance, providing it beyond the conflict areas, is going to be access, at least from the UN perspective, because it is a real question about where will the Tatmadaw allow the UN to operate. And because, you know, that is still very much a consideration for the UN. It is a consideration of security for staff and personnel. But also when it comes to humanitarian supplies, it's important just to note that just the humanitarian response plan for the conflict areas, it was only funded up to, I think, 10% as of last month. So even when it comes to the availability of supplies and assistance to then be distributed, you know, that's going to have to be an issue addressed with a great deal of urgency. And
you're talking about international donors on that front,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Like supplies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I gather though WFP went public recently and said their main problem, rather than supplies, was actually distribution. And Tom's point about banking breaking down and everything breaking down, WFP was distributing cash to people, yes, to buy supplies. Now there's not even any supplies often available. They're trying to do food distribution. It seems those two issues, availability of the ability to transfer cash and the ability to deliver food, are the main things rather than actual supplies. It seems to be a lot of international goodwill to provide donations for buying supplies. The question seems to be logistics. So What's your impression on that?
I think it's a combination of all those factors, and again, this issue of the internet outage and the difficulty to reach out to affected communities. I mean, including these communities that are now under martial law, these 6 townships. Even doing needs assessments is a very labor-intensive process. Even finding out what people need is going to be much more difficult going forward. So even how you structure additional appeals for assistance, let alone those very practical issues of logistics, getting supplies, and access to those areas.
Right.
It's sort of it is a layered problem.
Right. And definitely one for the international humanitarian groups to address. If neither of you on the screen have anything, I'd really like to end with a very good question, which everyone could possibly answer, and I think it's quite well put, from Vicky Tsang, who says, amongst the 3 main short to medium-term scenarios, we've got number 1, Tatmadaw and the junta SAC win, that's in inverted commas, and get, total control. Number 2, the protest movement, or CRPH, wins, as in wrest control back. Or number 3, extended stalemate, with all the horrific consequences that I think have become clear. So which of these scenarios do the panelists think are most likely? And obviously all have far-reaching socio-economic impact. What do you think will be the main challenges and opportunities of the likely scenario that you think is most likely? Slightly complicated question, and maybe I'll do it in the order that we began in. I mean, Tom, do you have a view? There's also a very interesting paper that circulated, I think you've probably all seen it, that outlined these scenarios plus 2 others which were halfway outcomes.
Yeah, I think for me it's the kind of extended stalemate that's the most likely. Both consolidation of control or a total win for the CRPH and the protesters seem fairly unlikely from where I'm sitting at this point, at least in the short to medium term. And in terms of humanitarian consequences, in terms of consequences for the economy, that is also the scenario that will have the biggest negative impact, I think. So we are going to see huge humanitarian needs, not just in the traditional areas, but also in areas like Ayeyarwady region and Magway region and these kind of areas that now are seeing an influx of people who were working in Yangon to support rural households and are returning. I mean, some villages in Ayeyarwady region have like families that have 3 children working in Yangon, and they've just come back. They've got no income, and they're having to support them. And there's a real question over how long that can be sustained, but I don't think that it's particularly long. And for a country like Thailand that has trouble controlling its borders with Myanmar and also China as well, the natural response for a lot of people will be to try to migrate informally across those borders and find work in those countries, because there are going to be few other options available to them for their survival and for the survival of their families. And I think Thailand needs to think very carefully about its response, because it's not just the COVID pandemic and refugees that it will be dealing with under this scenario, it will also be economic refugees as well.
Right, well put, thank you. A.
Yeah, I would agree with Tom in that the first 2 scenarios are, it's difficult to imagine how they would come to fruition, in that, a military win would require that hundreds of thousands of people decide, fairly spontaneously at this point, to cooperate with them. And after all of these people have been killed and after so much damage has been done to the country, and cooperate with some level of goodwill. And it, considering how adamant Myanmar people have shown themselves to be in the last 2 months of refusing to engage with the military and their Security Council. It's difficult to imagine the first one coming to fruition. And in the second case, perhaps it's a bit more possible, especially if, ASEAN's kind of visions of some sort of brokered deal between CRPH and the Damodar, and maybe with some CDM involvement, they can come to some sort of interim deal. It's a little bit more possible, but again, I think the sort of players involved are either not going to be able to move it forward or will simply just refuse to speak to one another. And the Damodar still has control over vast amounts of resources as well as weapons, and so it's unlikely that they will back down. And I think in the case of the third scenario, that's the most likely scenario, and I would kind of divide that into two types of scenarios that I think are possible. One is kind of what we talked about earlier in terms of kind of full-scale war, or sort of micro conflicts that are just constantly happening around the country that are not necessarily being directed centrally, but the country is kind of just in violent chaos. Or a scenario that's kind of like countries that are being occupied in war, where the Damodar is seen as, and are already seen as this kind of occupying force, and that there is a sort of underground silent resistance and sabotage movement, where Myanmar could really end up in both of those scenarios becoming a failed state, where you do have international humanitarian money coming in that might be exploited in ways that would continue the ungovernability of Myanmar, as well as a Burmese diaspora that is wealthier than it's ever been, combined with a population of people who don't have anything to do, young people, right? Migrant laborers who moved back because of the COVID crisis and haven't been able to leave since, students who are not in school, civil servants, many of whom, are quite young. In the country itself, the average age of the people of Myanmar is 29 years. So I think, we're looking at a prolonged stalemate unless something dramatically changes in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a happy view there. Not. So, James.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wish I could give a sunnier perspective, but I don't. I think that the long-term stalemate, which I think out of the three scenarios is probably the darkest, grimmest scenario overall. And how grim that situation gets and deteriorates is really going to come down to a few questions for both sides of this crisis. One is, for the CDM, how long can the core support and activists in the CDM continue to function without income, without cash, without jobs? How long are they willing to sacrifice that? The second is, how much blood are they willing to tolerate spilling? It's as was said before, it's quite a thing to ask people to keep continually marching peacefully into the face of automatic rifles. So, but then for the Tatmadaw and for their supporters internationally, essentially the question is, how bad is too bad? How awful can they be, and how much blood can they spill before they lose that support? I wish I had hopeful feeling, but my previous job before I took this one was on Syria, so I'm afraid that I have quite a dark view of human nature when it comes to the governments that, or the authorities that some states support. The worst case scenario here is this prolonged stalemate that effectively creates a situation akin to a failed state. And a long-term, low-grade insurgency type conflict that where you continue to have governmental structures being burned on a regular basis, protesters and bystanders shot and killed on a regular basis, and increasingly dwindling resources to provide basic health care or support or food support, humanitarian support. It's let alone the basics of life, education for your children. It's really a grim and bleak scenario.
Indeed. Thanks for that, James. And finally, Phil.
Usually I'm in charge of the bleak scenarios.
Well, we won't call you Mr. Positive, but I think you're in good company here.
Well, I mean, the thing that people have said, is the only way that scenario number 2, which is that the protesters win, is if there's some sort of split within the military. And we just have not seen any indication that that is the case. There's only been one sort of real insurrection within the military in its whole history, and that was 1976. There have been some defections by the police, but I think these people are primarily running away with their families rather than trying to stand and fight. So unless there's some sort of change there, I hate to say it, but I think it is going to move towards this kind of stalemate that the other speakers have also predicted. And, I think we'll see greater economic isolation and greater economic collapse. There's going to be, of course, an end to foreign investment we're already seeing, because, of course, anybody who's put money into Myanmar in the last 10 years is all of a sudden trying to figure out how to save it. There'll be more outflows of refugees. There's certainly that trigger of migrant workers leaving the country to try to earn income will certainly be a big part of this. And, if this will happen regardless or not of COVID. And so, Thailand needs to recognize that it has an interest here in trying to find a solution that doesn't result in the sort of complete failure of the Myanmar state.
Right.
And I would say we're also going to see just how completely unprepared and incapable ASEAN and the countries of Southeast Asia are to deal with this crisis. We continue to talk about national problems having regional implications, and often it's talking about like haze or refugees and boats and things like that. But the reality is right now, this is the kind of national to regional crisis that you need to have a enlightened leadership that is empowered to do things to take on. And you look at ASEAN and there's no there there.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Well done. I thought that was really an excellent and very, very disturbing discussion, speaking of which, as I said, this is the first of a series. We want to maintain the discussion. We feel it's really important to keep the issues out there and keep getting updates from various people, both inside and outside. The next one will be on April the 20th in the evening. If Bangkok does lock down, which is not inconceivable, we'll do it online. So do keep an eye on the details. And I'm sorry we didn't get to some excellent questions today, but which will be part of the focus in the next session in this series, which will look at the refugee crisis, the looming refugee crisis, and what is going on in the ethnic regions of Myanmar, and particularly a very relevant question which was raised today. We can't get to it by Hong Kong-based journalism professor Keith Richberg about China's role and how it's clearly concerned about the instability in the region. What will it do next? And also another question about how unified the military is. So hopefully on the 20th we'll have some experts that will discuss these and other very important questions. So thank you very much, Tom Keen, Amin, Thant, Phil Robertson, and James Rockefeller. Thank you, and thank you all for coming and listening.
Thank you.
Very much.